All right, so we're going to be talking about running buildbot with KDevOps. Just as an introduction, I started looking at KDevOps about a year, or not KDevOps, but buildbot about a year ago, roughly about the same time Jeff started working on KDevOps stuff. At that time, Ronnie Solberg was still at Red Hat, and shortly before he left, he had messaged me and Jeff about what they were using it for with CIFS. And he left his configuration set up on one of our build machines internally. And I started playing around with it. And it was myself and one of our interns just started hacking around with it, trying to add NFS into the mix. And that was right before the last in-person Bakeathon. And then Jeff did his DevOps presentation at Bakeathon, and there was a lot of stuff that I liked about that. And at the same time, there was a lot of stuff I didn't like about the buildbot configuration that we were using. And there was a lot of things that were hard coded into the buildbot config that was like test related stuff. Like all of that logic to say run FS tests was kind of hard coded into the buildbot config. And for example, even what tests you're running, that was basically a list of lists in the buildbot config. So each XFS test was like a different element in that configuration. So it was very static. Stuff like that. The way the VMs were being managed, they would basically, do an offline libvirt install, and then they would take snapshots of it. So each time it would basically be restoring a snapshot. It wasn't bad, but I really like the way KDevOps does it, where you're really starting from scratch every time and provisioning something fresh. Whereas, it's kind of like the pets versus cattle thing. Like the way what originally was, it was like a long-lived pet that you kind of curate. And I felt that was kind of brittle. So, after the last Bakeathon, I kind of looked at it a different way. It was like, why don't we run buildbot, but basically have all it's doing is kind of driving KDevOps. So that was kind of the approach that I wanted to take. So let me show you what I have right now. Okay, so can you see that? All right, perfect. So this, I actually just installed this one a week ago on a new machine. It has much more than, many more workflows than what I was previously running for the past year or so. Basically, what I had prior to last week was mostly just running FS tests. In the past week, I added PyNFS, NFS test. I've added the SMB testing, which I didn't have, and stuff like that. And I'm also looking at adding LTP and the Git regression stuff too. The way I have it set up now, it's a lot easier to add new workflows than it was even previously. So this is what you get when you open the screen, or when you connect to buildbot. And this is the home screen, and it basically shows you, I think, the most 20 recent builds. It also shows you, what's currently running, which I have a PyNFS job running right now. There are a number of different views that are kind of baked into the default configuration. And I honestly don't really find them that useful. So I'm not sure if you can pull those out of the config or not. For example, this grid view, I'm not even really sure what this is showing. So I've never even really looked at it too much. Likewise, this waterfall view I find absolutely useless. And maybe it's just because of how I've set it up. Same thing, console view. It shows all my build configurations across the top, and it shows you what revisions were tested and so forth. So this is a little bit more useful. For example, Chuck, a couple hours ago, you had pushed something to your NFSD next repository, and that actually triggered, and I can, click on this and it shows you, here's the, what was pushed, right? And that actually triggered a couple of builds. So it triggered a FS test build, it triggered NFS test, and it triggered PyNFS. Okay, and all those builds ran. But even this view, I don't really use this much. The main thing that I do when I connect is I go under the build screen and I go under builders. And these are all my different build configurations. Okay, so I basically have, and you can actually filter just on the top. So if I, say FS tests, this shows me all my FS tests configs. And it basically shows you all the recent builds. And now the reason I have a lot of red is because, like I said, I set this up last week and had a lot of, config issues and stuff. So initially, a lot of my builds were failing. So if we go in, for example, and look at this one, and let's see. Yeah, so here's, well, let me just back up here. So when you actually look at a build, it, kind of shows you all of the steps that run. And you can kind of see, all I'm doing is essentially what you do when you run KDevOps from the command line. It's pretty simple. But each one of those steps, you can kind of click it and it'll, you can see the output from it. And this looks, just like when it runs all the Ansible stuff. Right, so we go in here to the step that failed. And why did it fail? Well, this is the thing I was kind of griping about the other day, where it couldn't find JUnit parser. And that's because KDevOps is actually, when it installs things with pip, it installs them as root. And so the JUnit parser module was getting installed to, I guess, user local, somewhere under that directory hierarchy. But when I'm running, so I run buildbot as a local user named buildbot. And when it's running, it isn't loading user local into its Python path. So basically, I mean, the workaround for that was I logged in as buildbot and I did a pip install of JUnit parser. And that fixed that particular issue. I honestly don't know if this is a Fedora Python bug or not, because I did the same thing. Like on my Rawhide systems, I would log in as a normal user and just look at my Python path, and it was showing user local. So I'm almost wondering if the next time I do like a DNF update, if that issue would go away. But anyways, that's the sort of thing that you see when you've got a failure. Now you'll notice, well, let me back up here. So let's go to a build that ran recently. So here everything's kind of successful. And then this is the step that I added just yesterday, which was Anna's XFS test DB. So basically at the end of the run, it's automatically importing those results into the database. Let's see, what else would be interesting here. So all of these I have these all configured. So like Anna, Chuck, Linus, Next, and also down here Trond. Basically, I have it all configured so that it monitors a particular branch on your Git trees, and then when it detects changes, it kicks off a build. So that's very useful. So like, Chuck, when you did your push earlier this morning, it automatically fired off all those tests and I didn't have to do anything. Now, if I wanted to just run a particular test, I could go in here and there's this little button up here that says force, right? And all I have to do is click that and click start build, and it'll trigger a build. Now, all these fields in here, these are baked into buildbot. And the usefulness of these, it really depends on how you've configured buildbot. Like normally, I don't know how to explain this. Normally you would have like a Git repo and it's actually like building that repo. So you could specify, a branch and it would use that branch and so on and so forth. But we're not really building KDevOps. We're just running KDevOps to test something else. So, like if I wanted to be able to specify a branch and a revision, I actually could do that. It would require a little bit of extra coding. But as it stands right now, those fields aren't exactly useful. I can show you an example of where they would be useful. Let's see here. So for example, and I don't know if you've used this feature in KDevOps, Chuck, but you've got this kernel of the day thing. Okay, so this is what I use it for. So for example, the kernel of the day basically is, in KDevOps, it allows you to just specify the URL of a repository that has a kernel in it. Instead of just using the distro kernel that is on the VM by default when you boot it up, instead of doing that, or instead of building a kernel from Git, you can just point it to a repo. And so at Red Hat, we've got a couple different ways that we can do builds. So we use Koji, which, you can just, build a source RPM and send it off to Koji, or you can actually, from your Git repo, you can also send a build off to Koji. And when that's done, they have some automation that kind of packages your RPMs up into a repository and it emails you a repo file. So that's one way. The other way is the way we actually do all of our builds these days. We used to do kind of like the upstream list workflow. So we would have an internal mailing list, and the kernel maintainers would, pull those patches in and do builds and stuff. We moved away from that a couple of years ago and started using GitLab. So we basically file merge requests and stuff. So whenever somebody files a merge request, that triggers a bunch of pipelines, one of which does a bunch of builds. And if you go within those, if you drill down into those pipelines, you can actually get the URL of a kernel repository. So what I can do here is I'm going to copy. This is from an MR that Ben submitted, and hopefully I have access to it. But so I go into force. So I added this field right here. And I can just paste it in there and say start build. Okay, and it looks like, looks like those steps worked. So there's two different things. So this download the latest repo file. So when I'm doing these builds on RHEL, I'm basically starting with the with the base libvirt images, so like RHEL 9.3. But then I'm actually I'm using a different feature in KDevOps where you can specify a custom Yum repository. And so what I'm doing is I'm grabbing the Yum repository from one of our nightly builds. So every time we do a build, it also generates a repo file. So I'm basically popping that in there so that when it does the update, it's essentially updating to the latest nightly release. Okay, and the other repository, the one that I pasted into that screen, I've got some extra steps where basically what all it does is let's see, does it show anything? It doesn't show anything here. I'll actually show you the code that does it. But basically what I did there is I copied the config script from the kernel and basically copied it into the into that particular KDevOps repo, and I'm just running, config and set string the KOTD repo name and passing it that URL. So it's essentially updating my kdevops.config so that when it runs make, it pushes that into the extra vars.yaml file. So yeah, so it's doing that. So at some point in bring up, it should install that kernel. That'll take a while, so we can come back to that.
So is that kernel built somewhere else? Did you
mention? Yes, in that particular case. So in this workflow, I'm not actually building the kernel. I'm just installing a pre-built kernel. So yeah, I'm using like artifacts that were built somewhere else. So if I did a build using Koji, I could specify that. In this case, it's built by whatever our GitLab stuff runs on. It farms stuff out and does builds for all different architectures and variants and stuff. And basically you can drill down into those and get repos and stuff. Because, like GitLab, when it does that, it does all its own internal CI, which is, a lot more than this. Like it takes a lot longer for that stuff to run, and it's, less targeted than what we've got here. Like obviously, like I think maybe our CI probably runs Cthon, and maybe some specific jobs that QE might have created, but I don't think it's doing things like running NFS test. I doubt it's running FS tests and stuff like that. I think probably from an NFS standpoint, probably just Cthon and maybe a handful of QE specific tests. So yeah, was that Steve?
From my understanding, that is true.
Right.
So this is why I'm here actually, because I want to see, to get QE up and running.
Right. So that particular one is not building anything. It's just installing a pre-built one. Likewise, I've got some other. Oh, and I guess Linus just pushed, or I guess maybe he's probably got automation. But you can see here, this is this got triggered, right? I have these other ones that are nightly jobs, right? And they're very similar. I'm not going to actually trigger one, but I can show you what I'm doing. I'm just, again, it's downloading the latest repo file. And then I'm downloading this compose ID file. All that is it just contains a string that kind of has like the name associated with that build. Like it'll be like rel 9.4 and the date or something like that. And the only reason I'm doing that is because I have some extra stuff that, and I don't have it set up on this buildbot yet, because I've still got lots of things that fail from time to time. But when I enable it, basically what will happen is if a buildbot job fails, I get a notification on Slack. So I've got a bot set up on Slack that has an incoming webhook. And so that compose ID, what I'm doing is you can actually set custom properties on the build. And then when at the completion of a build, if you want to send out an email or send a message to IRC or Slack, there's all sorts of different ways to do it. You can basically add extra information into those messages. And so that's what I use that compose ID field. So basically what I'm doing here, and I don't know if it's going to show. Yeah, again, didn't really show anything useful in there. But you can see it basically added this compose ID. And I can also see it here in the build properties right here. So yeah. So the nightly workflow, it's very similar to the KOTD workflow. Basically it is just something that runs nightly goes and looks for the latest repository associated with that, spins up some guests, updates them, and does a run. So in this particular workflow, I'm not building a kernel here either, right? So for the KOTD stuff and the nightly stuff, I'm not building anything. But so if we go over here and look at this Linus job, well, it's still in the bring up step, but eventually it will, after the bring up's done, it'll do a build of the kernel and install it and stuff like that. Let's see what else would be interesting here. Oh, which one did I just run? What was running when we first jumped on here? Was it PyNFS? Yeah, I think it was this one. No, it was not. Finished 5 hours ago. It was definitely PyNFS. Oh, it was the nightly one, right? Yeah, finished 14 minutes ago. So yeah, you can see here, this is a, oh, but it was nightly, so it didn't do a build. Well, what we can do is we can look at, this one. Oh, I think we already looked at it, but yeah, you can see here, it did make Linux, built that version and installed it. So that's about it for the interface. Some other useful stuff. So suppose you've got a scheduler, or you've got a job that is just always failing, right? And you don't want, you want to temporarily turn it off. You can basically do that right here in the schedulers tab. And so all these force ones, these are the ones that, like, when you go in and actually click a button. But say I want to turn off the ones, if I just scroll down here, say the one that's related to Anna's repository, if I just want to turn hers off temporarily, all I got to do is go in and click these, and that'll disable them. That way, if Anna happens to push some changes in and I haven't troubleshooted the stuff on my end, it won't be triggering new jobs. So it's a way to temporarily turn that off, and that's kind of useful. That's really about it for the interfaces. You can see pending build requests. That is useful. So I basically added some locking around all these jobs, because what was happening, and again, it's kind of a consequence of how KDevOps works, right? And think about like Linus's tree. There will be pushes multiple times a day to that tree. And suppose I've got an FS test job running, which takes, roughly 3 hours on my setup. And so suppose something triggers a job and then it's running, okay? And then there's more pushes, like an hour later, okay? Well, what's that going to do? That's going to fire off another job, which is going to potentially, it's going to, from the KDevOps standpoint, is you're going to run make bring up again, which is going to find the guests already running. It's going to do make Linux, right? So you're going to have a different set of changes being built, and it's going to install that while your other stuff is running, which, and then after it does the install, it's going to reboot those guests. So now you're going to impact your job that was running, right? So that job's probably going to fail. And then meanwhile, this second job, it's going to be running. The first job gets to its completion, and it's going to do a make destroy, and that's going to kill the second job. So basically, I added some locking around it. And that's all baked into BuildBot. So essentially for any given builder configuration, there can only be one job running at a time. So what happens now is, say there's some pushes, and then an hour later there's some more pushes, and there's a job already running. Those will show up in the pending build requests list. And then, once that's done, then that next job will trigger. You can see here, what else? Last changes. I mean, this is kind of interesting because it'll kind of show you, well, what triggered the build, So you can see this is what was triggered in, yeah, it was triggered in the Linus's repository. Go down, where else? Yeah, so basically it'll show you, kind of everything that triggered a build. We already showed the scheduler. I only have one master set up. And that's, again, if the way I have BuildBot set up is it's pretty simplistic. Like, I'm not looking to run a build farm. I'm just running tests, right? But in theory, you could set up BuildBot so you have multiple masters and multiple workers and stuff. So like, for like a real software, software development use case, you would probably have your workers on separate machines and stuff. And I don't have that. I did set up multiple workers just because I noticed that that if I didn't, that things would queue up. So, a worker can run multiple builds at once, but it seemed like in the past there was a limit to that. So I just decided to set up 3 workers. And you can kind of see, this worker is kind of idle right now, but the other 2 happen to be running tests. So yeah, that's really it as far as the interface, as far as the web interface. Do you have any questions, Chuck or Steve?
I'm wondering if you guys package this for Fedora, or whether it's something I'm going to have to download from the buildbot.net
Yeah,
site.
it's not so I just install it using pip.
Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely not something that we ship. I'm not sure if there's RPMs floating around out there or not. I just kind of went in and, when I was getting started with this, I just went to the, buildbot.net and followed the tutorial. And that's just kind of the way I deployed it. Now, I made some changes since then. But yeah, that's really it. And I install it into a virtual environment in Python. And I can kind of walk you through that, at least show you some of the stuff that I did.
So that's where is that web browser running? Or where the web server, where is that running? Is that on the system that's running the builds?
Yes, that is the BuildBot system, and all you do is it just sets it up. There's there's one parameter that, like, by default, it only listens on localhost, and you just change it to the fully qualified domain name of the server, and then it'll be listening on the external interface, at least in my case. Let me share my terminal again, and I can kind of show you. Oh, it's going to do this again. Oh, there we go. So yeah, actually I made some notes here. And this is basically stuff that I copied, right from the, right from the BuildBot docs. So, here I'm just installing a handful of packages that are dependent. I basically create this is my sort of top level directory for the application. And then, in that directory, I create the virtual environment. Now, originally, this is not in the buildbot docs, and in the future, I'm going to use this. And the reason being, if you saw on the chat in the general thing, I was talking this in the general channel, I was talking about some difficulties I ran into this morning. Last night, I added Anna's XFS test DB into the mix, and it worked fine from, I would log in as buildbot and tested it out, and it worked fine. But then, I come in this morning and I've got jobs failed because it couldn't find certain Python modules. And so it turns out when you create a virtual environment, by default, it does not. So a virtual environment, essentially, it will use the base Python installation, so whatever's in that .zip file, and then it will append the site packages directory for that virtual environment, and that's it. If you also want it to include the system's site packages directories, you need to have this. So yesterday I had done I had installed a particular package, and because the system site packages directory wasn't in there, when it was running from the virtual environment, it couldn't find it. And you can actually change it after the fact. Within the virtual environment, there's a flag you can set in a config, and it changes it. And that fixed that particular issue. So that's just something that you should be aware of if you go to set this stuff up. And then this is so this is basically, anytime you set up a virtual environment, you set up a virtual environment, you give it a name. I called it Sandbox because I think that's probably what was in the docs on buildbot. Thought sounds good enough, right? Anytime you want to use the virtual environment, the command is activate. So you just source that file, and when you do that, now you're sort of inside your virtual environment. So anytime you do a pip install, instead of installing it somewhere in the global directories, it's going to be installing it within that virtual environment. So you upgrade pip, and then this is how you install buildbot. It's literally as easy as that. If you need additional packages, then you can, install additional stuff. So for example, I had written some stuff to do Slack notifications, which uses, there's a API in buildbot called HTTP status push. And in order to use that, it needs some additional Python libraries. It needs like TX requests or something like that. So I also install that. But if you're not using that, you don't need it. But once you've got buildbot installed, this is, this is how you create your master. When you do this, it basically creates a directory called master. And then within that directory, it will give you a sample config, and you can just edit that, and and you're done. And then this is the command to create a worker. So it's basically buildbot worker, create worker. You give it, I think one of them is the name, where it's running, what's the directory to create, and then what's the password it should use to connect. So I just used Red Hat. And then to start it up, it's as easy as this. And that's pretty much it. Now, there was some additional stuff. So by default, so buildbot, like the default install, it keeps all of its state information in a MySQL, in a SQLite database. And there's like some blurbs and some notes saying, if you have a lot of users or a lot of build configurations, then SQLite might not scale all that well. It recommends using like a real database, like either, MariaDB or Postgres or something like that. So I decided to try Postgres, and it actually wasn't too hard. But basically, here's my notes on that. And this is kind of cobbled together from various places. But basically, you just install Postgres, enable it. You set up the database. You have to edit I don't even know what that stands for, pghba.conf, but basically it's specifying what type of connections it should be listening for. And so I wanted to use password authentication. So I basically decided to change this line in that config file. I don't remember what it defaults to, but I basically changed it to MD5, and that allows me to use password authentication. So then you have to SU the Postgres user so that you can create database users and an actual database. And that's all I'm doing here. So you run, create user $P, and it'll prompt you for a password. I just use pwgen to create a random password and put that in there. And then create DB-O is the owner. So the owner is the buildbot user, and the name of the database is buildbot. And then, and by the way, all those steps, like if you wanted to use Postgres, you would actually do those before you create your master, right? So you set up your database first, and then I also had to install Psycho PG2, whatever the hell that is, something I needed in order to use buildbot with Postgres. So installed that with pip. So again, I did it in the virtual EMV. So I sourced that activate script, and then I ran these commands. So this is actually the command that I used when I created the master. So it has a --db, and you're basically giving it the URI or whatever it is, the connection string that it would use. So the only difference is here, instead of the word password, I actually put the actual password, and it actually sticks that in your configuration. But that's about it for that. So
Question.
Yeah.
Would it make sense to put these would you be willing to, I should say, to put these notes up on Linux manifest.org?
So
just to make them accessible for people.
I don't think they need to be on linuxmanifest.org, but what I probably will do at some point is put the configs in a Git repo and push them to GitHub. There is one item that I need that I want to take care of before I were to actually do that, and that would be right now I have like all my secrets in a text file that I read into the config, which is better than nothing, but it's not very secure, because if I actually accidentally add that file to my repo and push it, then I got to change all that stuff, right? There is a way to use, you can configure this stuff there's various ways to store secrets, and one of them is Ansible Vault. And I want to learn how to use that. And that way, at least the stuff is encrypted. So yeah,
Perfect.
if but that's at some point in the future. I don't know when I'll get to that, because
that's fine. As long as you get
to not spend so much time on this stuff and actually work on actual NFS issues. So this might be.
I won't tell Alice. Don't worry. I won't tell Alice.
Well, I mean, I meet with Alice on a weekly basis. So,
I do. Yeah.
So she'll find out either way. Right?
Get this.
Like, what have you been working on? Yeah.
This would be great to get into a GitHub. This would be great to get it into a repo, and then we can use Linux manifest to point to that repo. Is how I see it going.
Okay, so this is the sample config that it gives you, and it's it's got a lot of comments and tells you what to change. And then if you go down to the bottom, it actually shows you like the DB URL, and I X'd out the password here. But that's like a sample config. I'll show you a real config. And I've chopped it up into various parts. You could create a monolithic config, but it would get very large very quick. And I kind of find it a little unwieldy to manage that way. This is what my master config looks like. So here you can see I have a file called secret.py, and that's where it's pulling in like all my tokens and stuff that I don't want to show up in the normal config, right? And then all the stuff that runs KDevOps is kind of defined in these files, and I'll show you those. So basically I have a KDevOps common, and then I've got stuff that is kind of workflow specific. So I've got NFS tests, FS tests, and PyNFS. So here, you've got your config is essentially a dictionary, a Python dictionary, and everything. When you do the configurations, you're basically adding stuff to that dictionary. So here's my workers. Again, this is the one thing I couldn't figure out how to hide, which is why I just set the password to Red Hat. But that is basically how the workers connect to the master. They need to specify a password. So here you've got your change sources. And again, like in the monolithic config, you would define like an empty change sources list, and then below it, you might be appending to that. But what I'm doing is I'm doing all that stuff in some other subordinate files. So you got your change sources, your schedulers, your builders, but all the meat of the configuration I'm basically putting into these files. So each one of these is a different workflow. So I've got all my FS tests workflows, my NFS test workflows, my PyNFS test workflows, my Samba workflows. So all that stuff. All right. Services, again, is for various things like IRC, whatever. So I've got mail notifications and Slack notifications. And like I said earlier, I have them disabled right now because I don't want to get bombarded with failure messages and stuff. Especially since the Slack notifications is in our team channel, I don't want it spamming stuff. This is just informational stuff. This just kind of affects what shows up on the web UI. This is the thing that you need to change if you want to be able to access your BuildBot through a browser, and you don't want to have to do it from localhost. You just change it from localhost to whatever, name is bound to the external interface, and it should just work. Got my database URL here. And again, it's just a Python F string, and I'm just so in my secrets file, I've got these tokens, and it just substitutes that stuff in there. And then same thing for authentication. There's a ton of different authentication methods you can use. If it's just you can just use username, password type stuff, or you could even set no authentication. I have it set up to use Google's OAuth. And so basically I have created an OAuth token in my Red Hat Google account, and then pop that into here. And so what that allows us to do is to use our Red Hat Google IDs to log into the BuildBot, and that's it. And man, we are already at 45 minutes. Let's see here. Well, let me just show you. So you can see I've got all these different Python files. I'll just show you a couple examples. So this common file. So this is something, Chuck, that you should be aware of if you ever want to do things like being able to specify something variable in the interface, like pass it a URL or something like that, is the thing to understand that the BuildBot config is kind of static, right? So the only time most of those Python functions are executed is when the master starts up. So BuildBot has this annotation called util.renderer. And what that does is it's a way to pass information in at build time. So and that's all that I'm using that for. So basically, so in that web interface, when you enter something into that particular field, that gets added to the build properties as a property called KOTD repo that I called it. So all I need to do is, I just, get that property, build a command, which is, here's where I'm running the, the config script. And that's, so essentially what that's doing is overriding that config in that particular KDevOps repo. On the previous version, before I was using buildbot to run KDevOps, when I was trying to put all of the testing logic just directly inside of buildbot, I was using this util.render decoration everywhere. With the way I have it set up now, this is the only one I've needed so far. So let's see. We'll just look at the FS test as an example. They're all pretty much the same. So you basically, when you want to create a builder configuration, you have to create a build factory, and that's all that this does. And then, so this use progress thing is something I just recently added and haven't seen it really taking effect. But what the idea behind it is, it will track how long build steps take. Okay, and then after a while, that will allow buildbot to estimate how long a future build should take. It's something I just found this morning, actually, and decided, hey, that might be cool, so I threw it in there. But yeah, so your factory, you're literally just adding build steps, and it's pretty straightforward. These steps are all shell commands, so it's a very common pattern. And so the way I have it set up is each of those job configurations that you saw in the web interface, there is a corresponding KDevOps Git repo for that. So I've got like 40 different KDevOps repos in a Git directory. So it's basically running, so if I'm running for KDevOps NFS tests Chuck, it's basically passing that into this, and it's running, make with that workdir and so forth. This is something I also added recently, this halt on failure. That's useful because if you don't do that, the first step might fail and everything else will run anyways. So for example, if I'm running a job that does a kernel build and that kernel build fails, I don't want to bother running the test, because in that case, it's just testing whatever happened to be on the VM when it was spun up, which is not what I'm looking for. So I added that, and that is on all of those, with the exception of the make destroy step. I want that to run every time, right? I don't want any cruft to be stuck around. So yeah, so I've got that. I've got 3 different instances. So that is the normal KDevOps factory, and that's the one where I'm doing a kernel build. And then I've got the kernel of the day factory, which is very similar. I just have some extra processing that basically, does some parsing to figure out where to download the repository file. And then it, updates the, updates my repository file in my config and so forth. And then aside from that, it runs all the other steps. So there is a bit of copy paste that I could probably clean up and maybe shorten the lengths of these files even further. But right now, I'm not concerned with that. So it's just copying and pasting. And then same thing, nightly factory is very similar. I'm downloading a repository and updating some properties and stuff. But aside from that, it's very similar. So running make bring up, make FS test, etc. So then if I want to actually, so that code is all common code then that gets executed. So where do I actually create those? Where do I actually make use of those is here. So this is the stuff.
Is there a master? Is there a master one of this? Did you write all these, or did you just cut and paste from a master one? These
No,
Python scripts.
No, I wrote I coded all this.
Okay,
stuff.
okay.
I did
Thank
all
you.
this.
Good,
Yeah,
nice
I
job.
mean, I didn't do any of the changes in buildbot itself, but this is all configuration stuff that I'm showing you. It's coded up as Python files. But so when I actually want to make use of a KDevOps workflow, so here is an example of how I set up the workflow for Chuck's repository. So I basically define a change source, which all that does is it's a git poller, which is a Python function. And I just point it to what repo, the work directory, that's like the local. So where does it store a local? I think it's probably a git, like a bare git repo, but it basically uses that to detect changes in the remote repository. And then I tell it what branch I want to monitor. Okay. That's all I need to add to change sources. And then to schedulers, in this case, I'm appending 2 different schedulers. So this single branch scheduler, what that does is it fires whenever there's a change in the repository. So that's why I'm passing it this change filter, right? This tree stable timer, what that does is say there's a lot of patches being pushed, or there's some patches being pushed and there might be some pushed right after that. It basically waits. So I have it set to wait 5 minutes. That way I don't really catch something in the middle of a push or, in the middle of, if there's some pushes and there might be some pushes in the near future, right? So that kind of waits to let things settle. So that's one of the schedulers. And then the other scheduler is the force scheduler, which this is basically what adds that force button when you actually go into the builder and you can click that button. So if you didn't want to have something that was automatically doing it, if you wanted to manually go in and trigger buildbot every time, this is all you would need, would be those 3 lines. And then you need to create a builder. And so you basically, you run a builder config, you give it a name, you tell it what workers it can run on. You have to give it a factory. So this is the stuff that I was just showing you in that other Python factory. So it's KDevOps NFS test factory, and you give it the name. And then the lock, this is the locking I was talking about earlier. This makes sure that any given builder can only run 1 build at a time. And that's it. And so after that, it's really easy to add additional workflows. Like all of these things, if I could type, they all kind of look very similar, right? So Anna, Chuck, Linus, really all that's different is I'm just, changing names. I might be looking at different branches. So on Linus's, I'm looking at master. On Chuck's, I'm looking at NFST next. I just look at I looked at the individual repos and decided what I would be most interested in testing. So here's an example. So the kernel of the day stuff, remember I said I'm not building anything. So that's why the change sources, I'm not adding any change sources. And likewise, I only have a single scheduler, which is the force scheduler. But here you can see there's this extra one, this properties equals util.string parameter. That's actually what creates that extra field on that web interface. So that's that. Nightly, again, I've got, so here's a different type of scheduler. I don't have any change sources, but I have something set up to run nightly, and you can specify when. So I'm running, my rel 8 stuff is fired off at 3 a.m. every night. And then I also have a force scheduler. So it's pretty easy. So then, whenever I want to add a new workflow, I basically, define a set of Python files that basically define your build factories. And then for each workflow, I have one of these. and that's pretty much it for the configuration, right? If I back out of here, so basically each one of those is a clone of the KDevOps repo. I thought about trying to make just one central repository and stuff, but I decided that wasn't going to work because, well, one, you've got, you know, anytime you're in a repo and you run make, it basically generates a file in the root called extravars.yaml. So if you had everything trying to compete over that, it would be a nightmare. And I don't think you can override that. Likewise, you know, when you run make, it creates your local hosts file that Ansible uses. Again, so if I had everything trying to use the same repo, they'd be trampling over each other's Ansible host file. Likewise, they'd probably be, I think there's some guestfs stuff that might get created in the local directory and stuff like that. So I figured that this, yeah, I mean, I've got like close to 40 repos. I got, what's that, Chuck?
I was just about to ask that.
Yeah, it's not too bad, right?
So now, how do you make sure these are up to date with the KDevOps repo? Do you have something
that's all manual right now.
Okay.
Yeah. That's why, like, I had stuff that was working. Like a good example would be the Samba stuff, right? In you know, the last time I tested it, everything was working fine, and then I did a git pull and stuff broke, and it had pulled in some changes that, you know, that we recently fixed. So yeah, it's not automatic. Theoretically, and probably what I'll do is I'll go into those you know, those factory files and just add a step that does a git pull on the KDevOps directory, and that should take care of that particular thing. But like the .configs, right? That's all manual. So if I want to change some configuration, I need to go into this directory and run make menu config and do my changes and stuff.
Okay, so that's why you're not using make Mr. Proper on any of these.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So that's that. And then the other thing is that you should be aware of. So I've got all my stuff stored in. Yeah, no, not there.
There you go.
So I've got all that stuff in there. So basically all these trees, this is where, so when buildbot runs and it does a git clone, you know, to clone the, or it runs KDevOps and KDevOps does the git clone. This is where it's cloning it. So basically this is where all the Linux stuff is being built for the builders that do a build. And it's also obviously where the, you know, all the libvirt, all the guest images are. Yeah, so you can see I probably got, yeah, so you can see I got a bunch of VMs running right now for jobs that are running. But yeah, so all that stuff lives there. And right now, so this is on Fiber Channel storage, this particular directory. And it varies. So yeah, like I allocated 2 terabytes just as a starting point. And then I figured it really varies depending on how much stuff is running at once. I don't even know if I've seen it creep over 1 terabyte. And you know, that is because I'm running make destroy at the end of every job too. So so those vert images are not sticking around. I'm sure if I didn't run make destroy, I would probably run out of space real quick, especially if everything ran at once. But I could always add more storage to that later. But yeah, that's about it. And that is exactly 1 hour. And I need to run out very quickly. I've got about 5 minutes for any other questions.
No, just let us know when you push this stuff up to GitHub so we can steal it. I mean, look at it.
Chuck, in the meantime, I would be happy to just email you all these configs in the meantime. If
It
you were,
looks like I have a lot of homework to do, and I want to try setting up a basic configuration so I can come back with smarter questions.
yeah, okay. Yeah,
Yep.
definitely. But like, some other stuff like I was talking about earlier. Let me go and reshare the other tab. So for example, I go into this NFS test, right? You see all green, everything's happy, right? Well, that's because from, buildbot standpoint, the make command succeeded, right? But if I look in here, I've got new expunge files. Does it say I had bad results? I don't know if it shows that. My point is, this is the major piece that's still missing. I need a way to evaluate the results. And if I have to custom script some of that, that's fine. But I would like in KDevOps a way to definitively tell you that you've got some failures, not just for FS test, but for the other workflows as well.
You can put that in your import results step.
I could, yeah, I could, but really what I want to see is, like, especially with FS test, because it's got the ability to work with the expunge files, I kind of want to know, are there new failures? I think moving forward, I would like to see if we could come up with some way where we can kind of come to a consensus as to whether there should be things expunged in FS test specifically for NFS, and that we would commit to the repository versus the stuff that we need to go back to FS test and say, this shouldn't run on NFS. Some way for me to identify, yes, it's a failure, but we know about it, versus, hey, this is a new failure, you need to look at this. Because, the whole reason I set up all these workflows is I wanted to do something useful. I wanted to be able to catch new failures either in RHEL or upstream, and look into them and stuff. And not just for FS test, but for all the other workflows as well. And that's really the critical piece that's still missing.
So as a developer, I think that's great. And the place to do that, of course, is, just start going onto the Linux NFS list and say, what do people think we should do with this one? Or just tackle one and see what it is and then come back with your findings. Right. As a developer, though, I kind of want to see copies of, I want to be able to grep through the system journal and look for KMAM leaks and KSAN reports. Anyway, that's a sidebar, but I would like to see that added somehow into KDevOps as well. And I started down that road, and I got sidetracked because the systemd time sync stuff was a mess.
So yeah, when I had turned off KSAN, simply because it makes the jobs run a lot longer.
They do, but you find shit.
You do, and so maybe what I need to do is have a separate. I can create another workflow that does have that enabled. And what I need to do, though, because like specifically on the FS test baseline step, I added a timeout so that if it runs longer than 8 hours, that it fails. So obviously I would need to, and really that's what led me to turn off KASAN when I was testing against your branch. Because again, I was pulling in your config, which had it enabled, but then my jobs were failing because they were taking longer than 8 hours. But yeah, I think that would be useful to have KMM leak and KSAN and stuff. And again, it's you just copy paste some stuff and create another config, right? And maybe I wouldn't run that nightly, or maybe I would run it nightly, but maybe I wouldn't run it every time there was a push or something, stuff like that.
Yeah, or only on upstream kernels.
Right. Right, but yeah, it's definitely, it's, you know, and once you've got the bits in place, it's real easy to add those extra configs. You basically, you know, create your KDevOps repo, you do your menu config, and then you copy, paste a couple Python files, and you're off to the races. And it's pretty easy. Now, I mean,
I
it
appreciate the
might look a
time,
little
Scott.
daunting for you because you haven't done it. You work on it, you know, a couple days, and it'll start to make sense. And yeah, and that's the only other thing I didn't show was the stuff that I did with so yeah. Let me actually try to type in the terminal window instead of on here. Oh, I somehow put captions on. So, like I said, I just got this working this morning. That's why there's no results in my database. But this will, you know, as jobs run, this will fill up. So yeah, so there's from Chuck's run. These are the failures that I got. So 126, 444, and those other ones, I've been seeing that a lot. I have a feeling those 700 tests maybe not even are applicable to NFS. That 095 though looks new, so that would be one.
I've never seen that one.
Yeah, so that would be an interesting one to run. Yeah. Now, so what I would do in this case, if I wanted to look into this, is I would probably go into the web interface and turn off the schedulers for the Chuck repo. And then in the command line, I would go into that KDevOps repo and do, you know, manual like make, bring up, and et cetera, et cetera. And then actually, and I'm not sure if you're aware of it, Chuck, but when you run, you know, make FS tests, you can pass it tests equal and the exact test you want to run, and it'll just run that one test. And even if that test is in an expunge file, it'll still run it anyways. So that's a useful bit that is kind of buried into, I think it might be in the docs or it might be in a make file somewhere. But so that's how I go about it. I would basically, you know, turn things off so that I wouldn't get clobbered by the automated stuff. And I would just start troubleshooting in there. And yeah, it looks like I got something to look at. So
awesome. Yeah,
so,
this boils it down really nicely.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Now you can also see in Chuck's repo, I'm not testing RDMA and I'm not testing TLS, and that's stuff I need to go back in and enable. I had turned it off as I was doing the development. Plus, the previous machine I was running on was not as beefy as this one. So I was trying to limit the amount of VMs I was spinning up. But from what I've seen so far, this machine can handle a lot more strain. It does. It does. I don't know if you've ever used bpytop or anything like that, but it'll show you like how active your CPUs are. And if I'm firing off multiple things that are building, I've got like 80 CPUs that are all red, 100% utilized, and you can watch the temperature go up and stuff. But, you know, after it's done building the kernels and it's just running the tests, that everything kind of cools down and stuff. But so yeah. So that's
okay.
it.
No, I've got my summer planned out.
All right. Well,
Nice
it sounds
work.
good.
Very nice work. Very nice. Yeah. We need that. We definitely need to get this, you know, in a bigger audience, because this is a very useful tool. It's become a very useful tool.
Yeah, it's useful, but again, it's not like none of this stuff is getting contributed back to buildbot, right? Because it's all configuration stuff. I didn't have to change any buildbot code in order to do any of this stuff, and none of it's going into KDevOps either. And I had toyed around with the idea of adding an option to KDevOps to maybe make it spit out a rudimentary buildbot configuration, but it just kind of seemed a little too ancillary to what KDevOps is for, so I decided against it. But definitely, I will definitely, once I figure out how to button up my secret data a little bit better, once I do that, I'll definitely push this stuff out to get somewhere, because I think it's useful.
Yeah, because why reinvent the wheel? That's basically what, it's stop other people doing it. But yeah, as like Chuck said, we'll steal it. I mean, borrow it, and
Yeah.
when we get going. So I think this is excellent work. Very impressive.
Thank you. Glad you guys liked it.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, have a great weekend.
Yep.
Yeah, you guys have a good weekend.
All right. See y'all.
Cheers.
Bye.